This is what I'm being told by the politicians and central planners, so that must mean it's correct because they are the smartest people in the room, when it's the complete opposite of that. They are the stupidest people in the room. Canadian mortgage debt, which is stalling out for literally the first time ever since the 1990s. Are we in a recession or are we not in a recession? This is the debate that's going on right now in the mainstream media, if you can believe it, with everything else that is going on, with all the other data points that we have, with what's happening in the bond market right now. You still have these people in the mainstream media telling us, you know what, we dodged a recession. Let's get right into it. So let's head over to the Financial Post. Canada dodges technical recession but struggles to grow. GDP shrinks in the third quarter as exports, household spending, and business investment decline. So that really doesn't sound good, does it, when you really think about it? But it gets a lot worse than that when you get down here, because you're not going to believe what happened with the Q2 data. So we'll get into this right now. So first of all, the Canadian economy declined in the third quarter due to a decrease in exports. That's because of global trade recession that we're seeing essentially. So that isn't good, obviously. When we've got all these things going on, it doesn't equal good things in the economy. So that's happening. Flat household spending and decreased business investment in certain sectors. And I want to highlight that flat household spending, because if you really think about it, with everything else that is happening in the economy, and considering retail sales are somehow managing to post gains, even though I don't trust these numbers that come from the government, as you know, and you'll find out why in this article right here. But the thing is, when you look at that, they're actually saying, oh, retail sales are up. But when you actually adjust it for inflation, they're down. And then in the GDP report, they're saying that spending was actually flat. So think about that if you adjust that for inflation. Now, obviously, they're adjusting it for the CPI. They deflate these GDP numbers with the CPI. But the reality is that GDP, in my opinion, is a lot worse than the data that you're being presented by the government, because the real inflation rate has been much higher than the government's CPI. So anyway, let's continue here and see what's going on. So real gross domestic product shrank by 0.3% in the third quarter and 1.1% on an annualized basis. It would have been the second consecutive quarterly decline in GDP, which would have indicated that Canada is in a technical recession, but the agency revised its second quarter reading to a 0.3% gain, up from a slight decline. So we just managed to avoid a technical recession, at least according to the government. They suddenly revised that data and now we're not in this technical recession. I think that's just too much of a coincidence, don't you? Also, considering all the other revisions that they made, it just doesn't make any sense. So you know what? Whatever, that's what they're saying. The reality is, on the street, the economy is in a dire state, as we know. The consumer is absolutely hammered. We got the unemployment rate that is going up. We've got lots of people flooding into the country. There's not enough jobs to support those people. We just have all the ingredients, in my opinion, of a depression, what's happening right now in Canada. But I want to show you this data point because it's really interesting. So interest rates, as you guys know, have gone up substantially in this rate hiking cycle, which is on the right here. But what I want to talk about is, if you look at in the prior recessions that we've had in 2001 and in 2008, the Bank of Canada has actually been cutting during those recessions. Right now, they're actually holding interest rates high. And this might be part of the case of why they revised that to not a technical recession, right? It's because they don't want that stigma of still having interest rates this high during a recession. And I think the plans are that obviously they're going to cut if there's an economic crisis. But the reality is, I think they're actually going to hold if there's nothing that happens, because the thing is, the Bank of Canada, the way they see it is, if they start cutting rates, inflation is going to start rising again. So I know there's a lot of people out there who are gesturing and saying the Bank of Canada is going to cut rates next year, and they might, and that might happen because there's a crisis event, in which case there'll be a number of different things going on and we'll have to review that when it happens. But the reality is, if you look at what they're doing right now, they're holding these rates high try to stop inflation going up. So why on earth are they going to cut rates? Because in their mind, that would mean that inflation is going to start going up again. So they're just not going to test that theory. And we've seen them do it time and time again. They don't start cutting rates until something really bad happens and it spurs them on to cut rates. And in the last couple of hiking cycles, we've had these disinflationary times, which have been brought on partly by what's happened with China. A lot of manufacturing was offshored to China. We're now having the reverse of that, which is very inflationary. So that all happening is not going to create the dynamic that we've seen for the past 10 years. But you see, everybody seems to think in terms of the past 10 years and just after the global financial crisis, instead of thinking like what it was before 1980, because that's what we might be faced with. Because the reality is, I think we're heading into inflationary times. I think inflation is going to continue to come back down because the consumer is so hammered. But I think the reality is we'll have another government fiscal response which will drive inflation higher. And it may happen over a number of years, but I just think that is what is most probable, because the stigma attached to bailing out institutions and bailing out businesses and bailing out banks is really, really bad. So instead, they just hand the check to you, and then a lot of people are just too stupid to realize that that's going to cause inflation. Obviously, the government, it doesn't produce anything, so that's going to cause inflation. And then I want to take you to this. So Ontario leads Canada's real estate cool down as sales fall to crisis levels. Now, you have to remember, guys, that Ontario was one of the biggest housing bubbles in Canada. So Canadian real estate markets are slowing, rate of price declines doubles. So Canadian real estate markets are showing weakness across the country. Existing home sales fell 5% in October, falling 12% over the previous 4 months. At the same time, inventory is beginning to rise, helping push home prices lower. So the thing is, why I want to talk about this is mainly because how does this affect the economy? When we've got a economy that is so dependent on the housing market like we have in Canada, over 40% dependent on the housing market. If the housing market isn't doing well, then you have big problems. Now, obviously, we've been in a housing bubble, and when a housing bubble bursts, that creates years and years of turmoil. But the reality is that this is kind of showing us what's going to happen with growth rates in the future and how the economy is going to perform. Home prices declining, home sales declining, it doesn't mean good things for the Canadian economy because it's so dependent on that real estate market, whether you like it or not. That's just the way that things have unfolded because of the giant real estate bubble in Canada. Now, what I also want to talk about is they talk about inventory is beginning to rise, helping push home prices lower. Well, that's funny, isn't it, guys? Because we've had record population growth again this year. So how is inventory rising? And you know, I'm just playing stupid on this one, but the reality is that even though everybody on the internet, the mainstream media, the politicians from conservatives to liberals to NDP, they all cite housing supply as being the main reason why home prices are so high, that is just not the case. And you have a market that has been highly speculative. And in fact, these markets have been so speculative that that has just caused this bubble to march ever higher. And people have become ever more leveraged in this market as well, which has helped propel housing prices even higher. As we covered a couple of weeks ago, in some places, over 100% of condos were being sold to investors throughout 2021. So if you think about that, you really have a demand problem, you have a speculation problem because you're in a housing market bubble. And it does annoy me, frustrates me. It really fucking frustrates me because these politicians, they know. I know that they know that we're in a housing market bubble, but they refuse to come out and call it that all the time. Instead, that they just say, no, we need to build more homes, we need to do this and that. And basically, they're following the same narrative, essentially, both the liberals and the conservatives. We just need to build more homes. If we just build more homes, that will fix the problem. But obviously, that's not the case. And we're seeing construction and home starts that are actually declining from their all-time high levels throughout the pandemic when most investors were buying and we had the most speculative market of all time. That is when we had housing starts at all-time highs. That is now declining. So what is that showing you? These central planners and politicians and YouTubers, they can't think in a critical way. They have to think, oh yes, this is what I'm being told by the politicians and central planners, so that must mean it's correct because they are the smartest people in the room, when it's the complete opposite of that. They are the stupidest people in the room. And in fact, if they're saying anything, you should be thinking the opposite. And don't get too attached to different politicians, you know who I'm talking about, thinking that this person knows everything and they've really got things figured out, because the reality is they haven't, and they're going to spin a lot of things into complete political BS just to whip you up so they get your vote. So anyways, I just wanted to mention that because I think it's kind of important right now. And then obviously you've got this going on, which is Canadian mortgage debt, which is stalling out for literally the first time ever since the 1990s. There is no period of time where it has stalled like this on this chart. So this really indicates a bad sign, and it indicates that we are starting to hit the top in terms of the leverage ratio that we've got to in Canada. We're around 2.1 trillion. It's absolutely insane. The mortgage debt, it's more than government debt. It's more than private business debt. It's more than the entire GDP of this country. Just mortgage debt. That is how big this bubble got. So, you know, this bubble got absolutely massive. And the thing is, what's going on right now with the housing market and the economy in general, it means that we are heading for a deleveraging event. And that's when this comes down. This is actually a good thing long term, because it means eventually we can get to a place of recovery. We can allow the speculators to get burnt, and essentially a lot of people unfortunately will get burnt as well. There are a lot of people that are over leveraged, but that is what we have to do. We have to flush the malinvestment out of the system in order to get people investing in small businesses again, instead of just investing everything in real estate, and also allow people to buy their first home. That is the reality that we need to happen. And I know that most of you would agree with me here, because if you have kids, you'll know and you'll want them to be able to afford and buy a home and have a future in Canada where they can start a family. And the reality is why people aren't starting families right now is because of the high cost of living. And so many people want to leave the country, and it's all to do with the high cost of living and the housing market. So if anybody is wishing out there for home prices to go up, I guarantee it's just because they're benefiting financially in some way. And at large, that does not benefit society. It actually puts society back. So the standard of living will continually collapse. And those people, even they, I think, are starting to realize that the fact is we need home prices to come down. We need this crash to happen, no matter how much pain is going to be endured, because the reality is if you want to get to a place of recovery, you need that to happen. We've had so much malinvestment. We've had dodgy mortgages. We've got fraud that is at all-time highs right now. What else do you want? The reality is this is a housing market bubble. People need to face up to the fact, and it's a cold reality, but people need to know that we need this to happen. And me, I'm not benefiting. I don't want to buy a home in Canada, and I have no plans to buy a home in Canada. I have no bias on this, but this is just what I believe Canada needs long term, and we'll see what continues to happen. Hopefully the government doesn't come in and try and save this thing by doing something really stupid, which will have massive unintended consequences. So anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, you might like this video here, you might like this playlist here. If you're looking for a VPN to get around the censorship laws in Canada, I still can't believe I'm saying that, then go to expressvpn.com/market mania, because just like China, we need a VPN in Canada. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.